Hey guys, and thank you so much for clicking on this video today. In today's video, I'm going to be going through 5 tips for your first studio portrait shoot. Now, I think that this is a very intimidating thing, or it can be intimidating for a lot of aspiring photographers out there who have never used studio lighting before. And if it's your first studio portrait shoot, it can be very overwhelming at times, especially if you haven't had that experience with using studio lighting and experimenting before. I think this is personally one of the reasons I put off shooting in a studio for so long when I was younger, was because it really did overwhelm me to an extent and it did intimidate me. I felt that if I was going to spend the money in hiring a studio, because I didn't have a home studio at the time, I really felt that I wanted to be more experienced before I got in there and started experimenting, and really felt that I wanted to get the most out of a test shoot if I did hire a studio for the day and spend that kind of money to do so. But I think in the end, I really just had to make that leap. And I think for a lot of photographers, it really is about just throwing yourself in the deep end sometimes with this kind of thing, and just kind of keeping a few factors in mind for your first studio shoot. If you're a little bit overwhelmed, some of these tips might hopefully help you today. So my first tip for getting into a studio for the first time and photographing portraits is actually to keep it simple. And this is my biggest tip, because as I said, it can be very overwhelming when you're looking at a lot of studio lighting, particularly if you're not using your own lights and you're actually hiring a studio and using lighting that is different to what you usually use. I would say the best tip for this is keeping it simple and really just kind of looking at a one light setup if possible. I feel that you can do so much with just one light in a studio. It's incredible. And I think for a lot of people, they really do confuse themselves too much with how many lights should they be using, or what kind of crazy setup can they kind of make on their first day of shooting in a studio. And really, it should just be brought down back to the fact that you can do a lot with one light, and it's really going to make you less confused, less stressed and overwhelmed by the whole thought of going into a studio for the first time if you really just keep it simple and you look at one light setups. But this doesn't also just go for lighting, it really does go for other elements. So I mean, tethering is great, but really for your first shoot in studio, it's not a necessity. I think it's more about experimenting, really getting in there, being hands-on with what you're doing and being in the moment with what you're doing in terms of lighting, in terms of directing a model. And I'd really say don't sweat all the small stuff when it comes to this on your first day of shooting. Just make sure that you're keeping everything simple, and particularly if you're not used to shooting with artificial lighting. Number 2 really ties in with the first point, and it is to use a versatile modifier, so a lighting modifier. And what I mean by that, for example, is if you're only using a one light setup, then use a modifier on top of the light that's going to be easily tweaked or easily made to be versatile. So for example, I use an Octabox quite regularly, and I can actually take the filter off that and I can make it into more of a beauty dish style lighting setup, or I can add a grid to it and really direct the light a lot more. And there's actually a few other extra things that I can do to really tweak the lighting setup very, very easily with just having one light and one softbox. And if you can do that, then you're going to be able to experiment really gradually, and sort of, it's not going to feel too overwhelming for you to do so. It's going to feel a little bit more simplified and a little bit easier to really go outside of the box with your lighting setup with really just using one light. And in turn, it is still keeping it simple, which, like I said, ties in with the first point. Number 3 is also a big one, and it's actually to be safe. So a lot of people don't take this into consideration when they get into a studio for the first time, but there's a couple of little things that I would just say for you not to do. And one of those things is to make sure that you're not forgetting about sandbags when you're actually setting up any lighting, especially when you're shooting for portraits. You really don't want the other person to hurt themselves or to trip over a light. And if they do trip over a light, for example, then you want to make sure the light is going to stay in place the best it can, and that it's not going to tip at the slightest movement against it. So make sure that you have sandbags laying over the light, and also make sure that when you're packing up and you're actually taking the caps and putting them back onto the light at the end of the shoot, make sure that the lights have cooled down before you do this, because the caps can definitely melt, and I have seen this firsthand. So make sure that you don't do this, and don't make that very beginner mistake that I've seen many people make before. Also make sure that the cords that you're using connected to lighting and equipment, make sure that that is out of people's way, or at least make sure that it's very well seen and very well visible. And where possible, some studios will allow you to tape the cords down to the floor. This is quite a good idea, so they're not sort of sticking up and people can trip over them easily. But just make sure that you're keeping all of this in mind when you're directing your model, and make sure that they're aware of where these kind of hazards could be as well. My next tip actually relates back to directing the model, and it is to have a mood board reference for pose posing. Now this video is about getting into the studio for the first time and photographing portraits. So if you have not been in a studio before, it's very difficult to make that transition from shooting outside with portraits, for example, to them being in a studio, potentially with a blank wall, not many props with you, and nothing really to work with but the posing that you come up with in your head or the model comes up with. So this is something that I would definitely say would be helpful for you if you're not used to posing someone in a studio setting and you really don't have a lot to work with. Create a bit of a posing reference board before you go into the shoot, because then it's going to give you some direction as to how you can maybe direct the model and really help guide you along in that process. It can be very difficult, as I said, with a transition from shooting outside to inside in this way, and when you don't have so much to work with in studio, it can be a little bit scary when you're actually on set and suddenly your mind goes blank and you don't know how to pose your model. So this is just something that I would recommend doing if you are looking at shooting in studio for the first time. And my last tip for the day also ties back to point number one, which is about keeping it simple, but it's to utilize other elements, so such as V-flats and reflectors, instead of using an extra light or an extra two lights. So really keep it simple, as I said, keep it potentially down to one light if you feel comfortable with that, and then really just use whatever the studio has in terms of reflector boards, or there might be V-flats there that you can kind of use to shape the light around the model that way. And that's going to be easier probably than going and setting up another light or another 2 or 3 lights. And really you can do so much with just shaping the lights with reflector boards and things like that. So really experiment with that, because I find that more often than not, I tend to keep my setups very simple these days, especially with beauty. And those are the things that I tend to use in terms of using other elements to really create and shape the light that I want. So don't be afraid to experiment with those. They are there for a reason and they're actually quite easy to maneuver around. Sometimes you may need an assistant for things like V-flats and kind of getting them to sit properly, but if you go there with enough time to set up and you've got a bit of extra time, I definitely recommend experimenting with those, more so than getting a lot of other lights on board for your first photo shoot in studio. All right guys, well I hope you enjoyed this video on some tips for your first ever studio shoot, and I really hope that these tips have helped you today. This is something that I really wish that I had when I first went into studio, because I really kind of went in blind, not really knowing what to do, and it was a bit intimidating from my studio days back at college and sort of going in then and doing minimal work in studio. It was quite scary and intimidating for me, so I really hope that these tips have helped you out today. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, make sure that you do, because I'll be posting a lot more videos in future. If you've got any requests, please let me know in the comments section below, and I will see you in the next YouTube video. Bye!